right, let's move on to chapter 2 of Mr. Popper's Penguin. So chapter 1, we got to know Mr. Popper a little bit. We learned some of his family members. There's Mrs. Popper, there's Janie and Bill. We learned that he's a painter, and I can't wait to see if you think he's a good painter or not. Okay, so we're going to read chapter 2, and this chapter is called The Voice in the Air. That evening, when the little Poppers had been put to bed, Mr. and Mrs. Popper settled down for a long, quiet evening. The neat living room at 432 Proudfoot Avenue was much like all the other living rooms in Stillwater, except that the walls were hung with pictures from the National Geographic magazine. Mrs. Popper picked up her mending while Mr. Popper collected his book and his globe. From time to time, Mrs. Popper sighed a little as she thought about the long winter ahead. Would there really be enough beans to last, she wondered? Mr. Popper was not worried, however. As he put on his glasses, he was quite pleased at the prospect of a whole winter of reading travel books with no work to interrupt him. He set his little globe beside him and he began to read. "What are you reading?" asked Mrs. Popper. "I'm reading a book called The Antarctic Adventure. It is very interesting. It tells about all the different people who have gone to the South Pole and what they've found there." "Don't you ever get tired of reading about the South Pole?" "No, of course I don't. Of course, I would much rather go there than read about it, but reading is the next best thing." "I think it must be very boring down there," said Mrs. Popper. "It sounds very dull and cold, with all that ice and snow." "Oh, no," answered Mr. Popper. "You wouldn't think that it was dull if you had gone to see the movie with me of the Drake expedition last year." "Well, I don't think any of us will have the money for movies this year," answered Mrs. Popper a little sharply. She was not at all a disagreeable woman, but sometimes she got rather mad when she worried about money. "If you had gone, my love," went on Mr. Popper, "you would have seen how beautiful the Antarctic is. But I think the nicest part of all is the penguins. No wonder all the men on the expedition had such a good time playing with them. They're the funniest birds in the world. They don't fly like other birds. They walk up like little men. When they get tired of walking, they just lie down on their stomachs and slide. It would be very nice to have one for a pet." "Pet?" said Mrs. Popper. "First Bill wants a dog, then Janie wants a kitten, and now you want a penguin? But I won't have any pets around. They make too much dirt in the house, and I have enough work now trying to keep this place tidy, to say nothing of what it costs to feed a pet. Anyways, we have the bowl of goldfish, that's all." "Penguins are very smart," continued Mr. Popper. "Listen to this, Mama. It says here that when they want to catch some shrimp, they all crowd to the edge of an ice bank. Only they don't just jump in because there could be a sea leopard waiting to eat the penguin. So they start to crowd around and they push until they manage to shove one penguin off to see if it's safe. I mean, if he doesn't get eaten up, then the rest of them know it's safe to jump in and get the shrimp." "Dear me," said Mrs. Popper, shocked. "That sounds like a pretty heathen bird." "It's a weird thing," said Mr. Popper, "that all the polar bears live in the North Pole and all the penguins live in the South Pole. I would think the penguins would like the North Pole too, if they only knew how to get there." At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Popper yawned and laid down her mending. "Well, you can go on reading about these birds, but I am going to bed. Tomorrow is Thursday, September 30th, and I have to go to the first meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society." "September 30th?" said Mr. Popper in an excited tone. "You don't mean that tonight is Wednesday, September 29th?" "Why, yes, I suppose it is." Mr. Popper put down his book of the Antarctic Adventure and moved quickly to the radio. "What of it?" he repeated. "Why, it's the night that the Drake Antarctic expedition is going to start broadcasting." "That's nothing," said Mrs. Popper. "Just a lot of men at the bottom of the world saying, 'Hello, mamas! Hello, papas!'" "Shh!" commanded Mr. Popper, laying his ear close to the radio. There was a buzz, and then suddenly, from the South Pole, a faint voice floated out into Mr. Popper's living room. "This is Admiral Drake speaking. Hello, mamas. Hello, papas. Hello, Mr. Popper." "Gracious goodness!" exclaimed Mrs. Popper. Did he just say Papa or Popper? Hello, Mr. Popper up there in Stillwater. Thanks for your nice letter about the picture of our last expedition. Watch for an answer, but not by letter, Mr. Popper. Watch for a surprise. Signing off, signing off. You wrote to Admiral Drake? Said Mrs. Popper. Yes, I did, said Mr. Popper. I wrote and told him how funny I thought the penguins were. Well, I never, said Mrs. Popper, very much impressed. Mr. Popper picked up the globe and found the Antarctic. And to think he spoke to me all the way from there. And he mentioned my name, Mamma. What do you suppose he means by a surprise coming? I have no idea, said Mrs. Popper, but I'm going to bed. I don't want to be late for my meeting tomorrow. Okay, that is the end of chapter 2. So the question that you have to answer today is you're going to make a prediction. What do you think the surprise is that Admiral Drake is going to send Mr. Popper? Remember, Admiral Drake is down in the South Pole in Antarctica. And he said to Mr. Popper, I have a surprise for you, and it's not a letter. What do you think he's going to be sending Mr. Popper? Okay, tune back in on Thursday for chapter 3, and we'll learn what that surprise was.